Based on the fact that you clicked on this video, you are probably looking into the Canon EOS R and thinking about whether or not this is actually still a good buy in 2021. Now, I own two of these cameras, and one of them I actually only just purchased about half a year ago. So maybe I have some thoughts on this. However, I also have to preface this with saying that of course I am owning the Canon EOS R, and a switch of the system is not necessarily something that I want to be doing as of right now. However, I want to share some thoughts about the Canon EOS R. Maybe those will help you make your own decision on whether or not the Canon EOS R is the right camera for you. Because of course, that, in terms of camera talk, is always the most important question to ask yourself: which camera is the right one for you, not necessarily the best overall camera, because that just doesn't exist. Some cameras have their focus more on the photography side and give you more megapixels. Others might give you better low light experiences or may be better for video creation. Now, in the realm of choosing the right camera, some thoughts that go through my mind are that I want a camera that is full frame. So for me, that's a definite limiting factor in terms of what cameras I even start looking at. I have been used to full frame for about a decade at this point, and I don't really want to go to APS-C sized cameras. So for my own personal taste, for example, looking at the APS-C cameras like the Alpha 6400 or 6600 from Sony is not really an option. However, those might be really good options for you depending on your price point and your goals. Next, for me, it's also incredibly important that the camera is good for video and photography work. And on that front, when I was using Sony, I always felt a little bit strange when I had the Alpha 7S II and the Alpha 7 II. So the Alpha 7 II had about 24 megapixels and the S2 had 12 megapixels. And for me, it always felt strange bringing just the video camera with 12 megapixels. And now I know that there have been comparisons done, and I think Gerald Undone has made a video about that aspect as well, talking about that if you upload to Instagram, sometimes it's even better to use something that has less megapixels, or at least export with less megapixels and those kind of things. But at the end of the day, I still would like to have a couple more megapixels and great photo capabilities, whilst also retaining incredible video capabilities. And while talking about those video capabilities, on that front, I believe that the Canon EOS R is extremely powerful. It has limitations, and one of those limitations I will talk about, and it is mind-blowing to me that this is not fixed yet. But generally speaking, the Canon EOS R, if you are mainly focusing on the 1080p version or 1080p mode, is a really good camera. It has a great codec. You can choose between all-I and intra, which means that there's a compressed video mode, and then there's the full video mode where there's every single frame is captured and stored on the card. You can go up to 60 frames per second in full HD, and then of course in HD you can go to 120 frames per second, which has a great compression ratio, which means that there's actually a lot of information stored here, but the handling of the 120 mode isn't necessarily ideal, and of course it's just HD, so you have to scale it up, which again also not necessarily ideal. However, in my personal shooting experience, I think that 60 frames per second is actually really good, and you can go down to about 40% speed if you want to have that slow-mo effect. But also the 60 frames per second mode in this camera works just like the normal 23 or 24 frames per second mode, which means that you can actually just use that, for example, if you're vlogging and you want to have that safety to know that if there is something that's super interesting or super funny or whatever you might have, you can just slow it down in post. You don't really have to worry about switching between different modes if that's a style that you want to go for. Personally, I still like to switch between 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second, depending on what I am currently shooting, if I want to have those cinematic sequences or if I want to have just normal talking head sequences, which are usually shot at 24 or 30 frames per second. Now let's talk about the 4K mode in this camera, and that of course is very limited in my opinion. It has a 4K mode and it looks stunning. It's amazing. Even if you use it with an external recorder, then it's even a bit of a more stunning experience because you have that 10-bit 422 mode instead of the 10-bit 420, which you can record internally. But even internally, this camera can record up to 480 megabits per second for the 4K mode with 30 frames per second, and that's an extremely high quality image and absolutely usable. Now, the downside of the 4K mode in this specific model of the R system is that of course you have a crop factor of about 1.8. And I am going to make a video specifically looking at that crop factor and how it changes your composition. And of course, also looking at the lenses and how those are affected by the crop factor. Because for example, if you're shooting with a 15mm lens on the Canon EOS R with the crop factor of a 1.8, that turns out to be a 26mm lens. That can be a benefit, but in my experience, it also has been quite the drawback to have to work with those kind of changes in numbers, and I would absolutely prefer if this camera would be a full frame, full sensor readout 4K camera, but that's not the case yet. Now, of course, we have newer models in the R system, like the R6 and the R5, which have those 4K full sensor modes, and that's great. But maybe that's just a bit of a cost limiting factor to right now still choose the Canon EOS R over those newer models, because the Canon EOS R again is still an extremely viable option. It's really good in terms of full HD video, and something to keep in mind there when you're thinking about choosing a camera and what kind of video you want to produce is also if you even have the infrastructure to support 4K video production, meaning you need a really fast computer to do that, and also the storage needs of 4K are pretty insane. And I've tried producing everything here on this YouTube channel in 4K, and I quickly reverted back to 1080p because it simply just is not something that I can handle right now. The amount of storage, the amount of hard drives, and of course also the processing on the computer. Now, I'm looking forward to be able to do that, and at that point it will be even more interesting to think about upgrading my cameras to something like the R5 or the R6 or whatever Canon will release until then. But for now, I am sticking to 1080p, and for that, I really love the quality of the 1080p the Canon EOS R provides. Something else on the video front is that the Canon EOS R has a completely articulating and flipping out screen, which means you can use it to vlog yourself and you can just simply see what is going on. That is something that even if you go for the Sony a7 III, for example, is not there a possibility. There are, of course, alternatives like the Sony a7S III that has a flip out screen at this point, and that's great. And even the A7C, I think, also has that flip out screen. And maybe there are others that are interesting that also have this feature. For me, that was actually one of the main reasons why I switched away from Sony back to Canon, because they released this Canon EOS R about 3 years ago or something like that, and it has a flip out screen, and I was not used to that. For switching to Sony, I actually used the Canon EOS 5D Mark II, which didn't have a flip out or swivel screen at all. And then I switched to Sony with the a7 II and the a7S II. Both of those had articulating screens, but not flipping out, so you couldn't actually see yourself whilst you were filming something. You could just help yourself in certain weird angles or something like that. But then Canon came with this flip out screen feature in the Canon EOS R, and I was definitely going to switch to that. And I actually love the fact that I have this feature. This is for me absolutely important and necessary for easier vlogging and video creation, especially in these types of settings where I just want to know whether or not I am actually recording. So that's an absolute no-brainer for me. I need that kind of feature. However, there are nowadays more cameras on the market that also feature this. Even the RP, the R6, R5, and the Canon realm, of course, all of those have this feature to be able to flip out the screen and see yourself whilst shooting, or use it when you're shooting different angles, and that is always helpful in my opinion. Then let's talk about handling, and in my opinion, the Canon EOS R fares really, really well on that front. It's a nice chunky body which feels great in my hands and is easy to work with. I have a certain amount of quirks that I would love to be able to change, one of which being that the on-off switch is here on the left side, and I would prefer if it were on the right-hand side, so I can use that with a one-handed grip instead of having to first turn the camera on and then have the other things available. The other thing that I would change is the touch bar, which I don't find very useful. It never really clicked with my use case. And the ability to have a wheel around the set button right here at the back would also greatly be improving the using of the camera. Lastly, we have the mode dial. That's a bit of a getting used to situation. You have to press the mode dial and then click the info button to switch between video and photo shooting. Can be a bit of an annoyance, but you get used to it. I hope that they change that at some point to, again, have a bit of a flick or a switch to be able to switch between those two things. But for now, we are stuck with this. But overall, you can change your settings with this wheel and that wheel, so that's easy enough. And of course, it's just a overall nicely handled camera. And I have heard this from many people to say that this kind of camera, the Canon cameras overall feel more like cameras and the Sony cameras feel more like computers. And I actually have the same feeling after using the Sony cameras for 3 or 4 years. I was really appreciative of coming back to Canon when I did, and the ability to just know how I have to use things and how things function. This doesn't mean that this camera is perfect, because Canon kind of likes to leave things out, and even if it were just a software update or a firmware update, they still don't actually bring things back to cameras. Like, for example, focus stacking is a feature that they now have in the EOS RP even. So that's a cheaper camera than this. However, they did not include the focus stacking in this camera. I don't know why. And the next thing is the missing intervalometer. Of course, Canon just doesn't like to include those. You have to purchase one externally. And you have a time-lapse feature now built into this camera. However, you cannot shoot and store all the individual images when you are doing one of those time-lapse shootings. But with that, we are down to the last 2 points with this camera. One is the video record time limit, and the other one is the lens selection. Now, starting with the video record time limit, of course, that is a absolutely, I don't know why that's still a thing. Canon has still a 30-minute record time limit in the Canon EOS R, the RP, the R6, and the R5. And unless you are using an external recorder, which I usually do here because of exactly that reason, you are going to be limited by that. You have to set a timer to remember to reset the camera when you're shooting for longer periods of time. You really have to keep your eye on the red dot, whether or not you are still recording, to know that you are still recording. And I think that's absolutely annoying, and I hope that Canon will get the message and release that stupid limit at some point. Everybody else kind of has done that, and I don't know why Canon still is holding on to that. I don't think that they are protecting the other gear. Maybe they just haven't gotten the memo that this tax situation somehow has changed in the last, I don't know, 4 years or something like that. But I do hope that Canon will get rid of this stupid limit at some point in the near future. I know that they are capable of doing that because they have the cinema cameras which don't have those limitations. So why not bring that over to the R lineup, which would be super helpful in all of those kind of situations where you don't want that kind of limit. For example, if you're shooting an interview, you don't want to always have to look for the red dot and check whether you're still recording or not. And I find it extremely annoying that I would have to do that if I weren't recording on an external recorder. And that's, by the way, also one of the main reasons for me not to have upgraded yet to any of the other Canon cameras like the R6 or the R5, because they still have that limit. And I, right now, don't want to upgrade if I still would be limited by that factor. So that's one of the big things for me that is just an annoyance. Now, I still am in the R system and I am using this camera, and I even purchased a second Canon EOS R to use for my video productions despite this issue, because I love so many other things about this camera, like the colors, the video quality, and the last point, the lens selection. The Canon RF lenses are incredible. They are, I don't know, masterpieces of glass, and I just love what Canon is doing there with this kind of mount. They have incredible features built in here. They have superb glass, and it's just a real joy to work with these. Of course, they are pricey, but if you get into this system and you start investing into this new lens lineup of the RF glass, you then can also, of course, always change out the body. And you have that availability to upgrade your body on the go whilst you are still using the same glass. And based on the fact that Canon was using the EF mount for like 30 years, you're probably going to be good for a good decade or two with this kind of glass in these kinds of environments that we are living in right now. Now, I recently just upgraded to the 70-200 f4, and I also got the 15-35 2.8 for my kit for vlogging and stuff like that. And of course, the video production with the gimbal that you can see there in the background. but I have to say that I'm just blown away by the image quality that these lenses produce and also just the feel and look that I get with all of that. Now, Sony might have certain other benefits, for example, that you can adapt just about any lens onto the Sony E-mount, but if you want to stay in one system and you want to have a cohesive experience, then I think the Canon EOS R and the RF mount are a great environment to be in. Now, of course, other manufacturers and models also intrigue me. I would love to be able to upgrade to the R5 or even R6. And of course, the Sony world is not necessarily without its interest as well, especially with the A7S III, which they released last year. Now, personally, I still hope, and I'm crossing my fingers, that Canon will catch up in terms of the 30-minute record time limit specifically, and of course also maybe bringing us a 4K 60 frames per second model, which is not necessarily as crazy priced as the R5. But with all that, we will have to see how that goes. And until then, I just feel good in the realm of the RF mount system with the Canon EOS R, and I do believe that even in 2021, the Canon EOS R is a great buy. It's a powerful camera which produces incredible video footage, and especially if you are a creator that wants to do video work and photo work, and also maybe switch in a bit of a vlogging perspective, I think the Canon EOS R or even the RP are incredible choices. Now, to close things off, I want to talk about the RP versus the R. And there, I would actually have to say that it is pretty darn close between the two. They are an incredibly close comparison. And of course, the RP is even cheaper than the Canon EOS R. Now, I personally did not choose the RP mainly because the RP does not have the all-eye codec, which provides you with better image quality whilst shooting. And I think that there are also a couple other limitations. However, I recently saw someone talk about choosing your right camera, and the RP is a full frame camera. It has a flip out screen and you can shoot 1080p and I think even with 60 frames per second. And all that packed in a body that's just about $1,000 is pretty darn incredible. And using that to get into the RF system, being able to invest into better glass and later on in your journey being able to upgrade then, I think that might be even a better choice. Now, I was almost held back. I wanted to have the R because that gives me the better quality codec, the all-eye codec for 1080p footage. But looking at the specs of the RP, you still get about 26 megapixels, which is just 4 megapixels less than the R has. You get 4K recording, and you also get full HD up to 60 frames per second recording. Of course, those are in the intra-frame codec, which means that they are lesser quality than the all-eye codec. But honestly, I've been shooting in the intra a lot of the time nowadays because it is less storage, and for some reason my computer even can handle it pretty easily. So with that said, and in closing, the RP and the EOS R are incredible cameras, and they are a great stepping stone into the RF mount system from Canon. And I would absolutely recommend you check those out and not necessarily need to go for anything bigger. With these bodies, you can get into an incredible lens system with the RF lenses, and of course there are also the adapters from the old EF glass, so if you have EF glass and you want to adapt those adapters are also a viable option. Now, with all that said, I hope this was an interesting or informative video for you. I would appreciate a thumbs up if it was, and of course if you have any other questions, you can leave those in the comment section down below. Now, I hope you can find the right camera for you, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao!